The senior knight looked at the boy with displeasure. It was this man who had been the first to betray and abandon the Baron. Since it was Newman who had sold information about the Baron to swindlers, he owed a hefty debt. The hero looked at the swordsman with disdain and wondered how such a man could even be the senior knight. The young man looked at his interlocutor with a grin and asked him what he thought they were doing. The man frowned and said that he could not believe that an aristocrat was forcing the militia to do dirty work. He added that, as the head of the knights, he could not tolerate this. The guy leaned on the shovel and thought it was nonsense because the hero was earning money to pay off his debts. He said that he had obtained the Baron's permission. The knight stood opposite the aristocrat. Newman said that he did not know how the young man had outwitted his lord, but offered to recall the young master's past. The man frowned and suggested that his interlocutor was using the militia forces for personal gain. The brown-haired man closed his eyes, then smiled and replied that he was right. The hero glared menacingly at the swordsman and warned that he would get it now. The warrior's face instantly distorted with anger and irritation. Just think about his weak self-control. If the knight had tried to play an online game, he would have exploded in a minute. Lloyd pulled the tool out of the ground and, swinging, threw sand at his interlocutor. The soldiers stared at them in shock. The man covered his eyes with his hand in displeasure, and the brown-haired man only grinned. The swordsman was shaking with anger. He looked at the young man angrily and was indignant that he had really tried to tarnish the knight's reputation. In his mind, Newman called him the stupid son of a nearly bankrupt baron. The hero put his hand to his ear and asked if his interlocutor really wanted to throw away his regalia and fight. The guy swung his shovel and pointed it at the warrior. Lloyd smiled and suggested a duel. The flushed man raised his eyebrows and warned that the young man would regret it. Frontier Estate. The hero was going to duel Newman in a month. Xavier looked at the gentleman and asked if he was so sure of his victory. The aristocrat was sitting on the bed, crossing his legs. He looked at the knight and exclaimed that he was not. The boy added that his opponent was a knight called the Heart of Mana and a junior sword expert, and he himself was just a lazybones. Naturally, he was not up to fighting him. The young man asked if the other man had even thought about it before asking such a question. Xavier frowned in irritation and squeezed the hilt of his sword. Then the warrior loosened his grip and noted that he had almost cut down the gentleman. He looked at the hero picking his nose and could not believe that he had suddenly thrown dirt at the Newman knight and even asked for a duel. Perhaps the young man wanted to be a scoundrel again. However, the boy himself asked the Baron for a favor, then entered into an argument and pushed Xavier away. By this time, he had appointed Knight Bayern as a temporary manager and was in charge of the construction team. However, the young man was unsure about this duel. The brown-haired man pulled a booger out of his nose, and the other man immediately wanted to hack him to death. The hero wiped his hands and said that the knight had to do something. The young man smiled and asked to be taught how to handle a sword. The other man frowned and said that he did not want to. The aristocrat looked at him with disappointment and asked why. The swordsman replied that, first of all, it was his duty to protect the young master. The blonde man looked calmly at Lloyd and added that he was like a sack, and if a sack learned fencing, it would be even more dangerous to be around him. The aristocrat asked to at least speak more softly. The brown-haired man once again clarified whether the knight really did not want to teach him. The hero smiled confidently and said that he would deal with his insomnia in exchange. Xavier looked at the gentleman in shock, not understanding how he knew about it. The young man grinned and thought that, thanks to the novel, he also knew the reason for his insomnia. In the work The Knight of Iron and Blood, knights are divided into 4 levels by rank: Sword Master, Supreme Sword Expert, Middle Sword Expert, Junior Sword Expert. Xavier's level is Supreme Sword Expert, and he will soon become a Master Sword Master. The reason for his insomnia is his inhuman nerves, which are too sensitive. This is the so-called Sword Master Syndrome. The brown-haired man leaned on his hands and thought that in the countryside they do not know such things, so the knight himself does not know either. The hero looked at his interlocutor and asked if he agreed to the deal, because it was written on his face that he had insomnia. Xavier sighed and replied that he would try. The nobleman smiled and asked him not to give in to him. The swordsman chuckled and said that he was saying this because the young man would definitely fail. He had tried many things to cure his insomnia, starting with cognitive behavioral therapy, herbal remedies, aromatherapy, exercise, oriental medicine, and the like. The knight was sleeping peacefully in a chair, hugging a pillow. The protagonist stood in front of him and chuckled that he knew exactly how to cure insomnia. The 18th magic technique is reading a manual on reinforced concrete structures. This is what puts you to sleep. The guy grinned and thought that all the swordsman's skills would now be his. The sun was shining in the sky. The refreshed and well-rested knight looked at the master and ordered him to run 50 laps. The hero looked at the warrior in surprise and turned around and ran. The swordsman turned to look at the master and was amazed that he ran without complaint. Lloyd was running circles around the training ground. He ran up to the knight and muttered in a tired voice that he hated it and was eager to learn something. After these words, the guy ran on. Having completed the next circle, the hero smiled at his interlocutor and asked if he expected that the aristocrat would not be able to and would whine. The warrior continued to watch the gentleman running circles. At the next turn, the sweaty guy exclaimed that the knight would have simply said that the young man was not cut out for it and waved him off. Xavier shuddered, because the interlocutor guessed right. The brown-haired man ran on with a laugh, shouting that he would run to the end. Notification: passive skill ugliness increased to level 4. Anyone who sees you will take you for a freak and will feel the desire to punch you. The young man got angry and exclaimed that he did not have such a skill. The hero was sweating and breathing heavily. It would be a lie to say that he was not tired. However, this was nothing compared to his life in Korea. He had no family to give him warmth. Every morning the boy opened his eyes in a crowded Gishiwan. Every day he carried bricks to the 4th floor of the villa. Every night the boy loaded trucks with boxes just to not die of hunger, always dreaming that someday it would get better. The young man encouraged himself that he was doing well, was qualified, and there was still a little bit left. But the light he was reaching for suddenly went out, and the hero was left alone with the darkness. Compared to that pain and despair, this was nothing. Lloyd ran under the moonlight and smiled. The knight continued to stand nearby. He looked closely at the master and thought that he would teach him his fencing technique if the aristocrat was so sincere. The brown-haired man continued to turn circles. Notification: Xavier's opinion of you has increased by +1. His opinion of you is -28. You have received 18 RP for slightly improving your relationship with a key character. Score: 29 RP. The manor was illuminated by the moon. The Baron sat at the table and looked at Newman standing in front of him. The man could not believe that his son would be so rude to the one who had protected their family for 5 generations. Arcus leaned on his hands and muttered that he thought the boy had come to his senses, but he must have misunderstood him. He looked at the swordsman and said that it was his moral duty not to interfere with the duel. Still, the Baron asked him not to be too cruel to the heir to the estate. The Lord looked at his interlocutor intently and ordered that the boy be brought to his senses, but not crippled. Newman bowed and accepted the request. The knight smirked and thought that he did not know if he could do it during the duel. He walked down the corridor, determined to kill this arrogant bastard. And if the Baron made a big deal out of it, he would destroy him and the Baroness too and pass it off as suicide. The swordsman smiled and thought that, as planned, he would then leave this village for a better place. Thanks to the young master, his plan was coming to fruition faster than he expected. A month passed. Spectators gathered around the training ground to watch the nobleman and the knight standing opposite each other. The protagonist's parents were sitting under the canopy, looking nervous, while Xavier and Baron stood behind them. The man raised his sword and asked if his opponent was ready. The boy took a step forward and, throwing the shovel over his shoulder, answered in the affirmative. He smiled confidently and advised his opponent to get ready to rake in the dirt. While the young man stood there grinning, the people around him were discussing the fact that the gentleman would be fighting Newman with a shovel. The blonde gritted his teeth in anger. Xavier looked down at the hero and noticed that the metal shovel had been ordered from a blacksmith. Arcus covered his face with his hand and muttered that his son was an idiot who thought this was some kind of joke. The knight looked at the sight carefully and thought that if he remembered what the young man had been doing for the past month, it might not be a joke. The gentleman did general exercises early in the morning without complaining, then went to the construction site to explain the boiler room to the village engineers, and after that, trained with a sword until he wanted to sleep. This did not look like a man who was just joking. Xavier frowned, sure that the young gentleman was serious. The Baron raised his hand and announced that the duel between Lloyd Frontera and the knight Newman was about to begin. The man took a fighting stance, and the boy grabbed the shovel with a grin. Xavier frowned, not understanding what kind of stupid stance this was. The blonde attacked first, outraged by his opponent's behavior. The brown-haired man swung the shovel and easily blocked his opponent's blow. The father and the swordsman standing behind him stared at the duelists in surprise. Newman swung again and thought that the young man would not be lucky a second time. However, this attack was also blocked by the young gentleman. Xavier's eyes widened and he realized that this incredible and effective technique was used in real battles, as if his swordsmanship had suddenly improved after so many years. The opponent began to sweat and looked warily at Lloyd. The young man grinned and thought that there was nothing surprising in this, because in Korea every man could do this. This is a modern hand-to-hand combat technique, a bayonet attack. He lunged with the shovel, and the opponent recoiled in fear. The hero covered himself with the tool, using it as a shield. Then he made another lunge with the tip, but the man dodged. The young man thrust the weapon into the ground and, laughing, began to jump on it. Xavier sweated and wondered if the aristocrat was really joking. The sweaty guy continued to laugh, but his gaze remained confident. The watching knight tried to understand his plan. Newman ran up to attack with a cry. The brown-haired man took a fighting stance and thought that the first thing he had prepared for the enemy was a shovel, and the second was the basic fencing that Xavier had taught him. The young man fought off the attacks and gradually pushed the enemy back. The man clenched his teeth in irritation. not understanding when the drunkard and scum had become so strong. The third thing the hero had prepared was this, a synchronized skill for handling a tool. Digging, level 1. Become one with the shovel, body and soul. The level of synchronization between you and your shovel will increase. The guy swung, and his tool began to glow. Xavier's opinion of the hero increased by +1 during the training. And the Baron and Baroness, who saw their son's sincerity for the first time in their lives, had it increased by +2 and +3. They accumulated 97 RP, which allowed them to purchase an additional skill for 40 points. Then the hero realized that he had learned a pretty cool skill. He looked closely at his opponent. The man exhaled and swung his sword. Newman thought that he had no choice. It was unlikely that this should be used against an ordinary person, but he wanted to. A glow began to emanate from his body. Xavier narrowed his eyes. The enemy was pumping up mana. The brown-haired man frowned, realizing this. The enemy was about to use a mana heart. The mustachioed man grabbed the handle and, frowning, declared that now everything was serious. The young man did not answer, and the opponent rushed at him. The knight watching them frowned and thought that someone who had not had any talents for 10 years, even the most ordinary ones, would need at least 5 years to master the mana heart. The young master would not be able to block such an attack. The man swung his blade. The boy held the shovel in front of him, but the enemy only grinned, confident that he would cut it in half and break the aristocrat's skull. The protagonist's parents jerked in horror, and the woman covered her mouth with her hands. The blow hit the shovel, but it did not flinch. Newman stared ahead in shock. He felt like all his strength was leaking out. Lloyd smirked and thought that this was the fourth skill he had prepared, Mana Mastery, which made Xavier the strongest man in the novel. The knight watched the duel closely. Mana flowed into the boy's body through the weapon. This was the technique of the Asrahan core. The man recoiled in fear and exclaimed that his mana had been drained. At that moment, the hero swung and hit his opponent in the face with a shovel. A broken tooth flew against the blue sky, which its owner looked at sadly. Lloyd's next blow was to the chin with the opposite end of the tool. The boy looked down at the swordsman with an ominous look and hit him hard on the head. Newman fell flat on the ground at his feet. All the spectators widened their eyes in shock. They saw the knight lying in front of the boy, but they could not believe that the young master had won. Arcus raised his hand in confusion and announced that Lloyd Frontera had won the duel. The blonde was lying on the ground and did not understand how such a master of the sword could lose to the scum. The aristocrat came closer and, throwing the shovel over his shoulder, said that the man had been beaten. The hero swung and said that it was time for the long-awaited punishment. The man looked up in fear. The Baron jumped up and shouted that the duel was already over. The young man began to beat the enemy with a shovel. Arcus frowned and shouted his son's name in rage. The knights immediately began to hold the protagonist so that he would stop hitting Newman with a shovel. Bayern stood next to Xavier at this time and looked at what was happening with an angry expression, suggesting that the protagonist had gone crazy. At this time, Xavier looked ahead with sadness and realized that Lloyd could have lost his mind. The protagonist at this time waved his hands and sighed heavily, because he ordered to let him go because he had calmed down. Then he put the shovel on the ground and his hands on his belt, sighing with relief. Then he started hitting his opponent with the shovel again and they tried to restrain him again. Xavier looked through his bangs with displeasure and realized, if you look closely, he was hitting him so as not to hurt him too much. At this time, the blonde with a mustache screamed from the blows. The brown-haired man at this time looked at his opponent angrily, but Xavier saw this calm expression on his face because he seemed to know in advance what would happen next and as if he already knew everything. At this time, the guy with blue hair looked ahead coldly. In his memories, 15 days before the duel, the brown-haired man leaned his hand on the blade and wanted to learn the Azarakan technique of the mind. At that moment, Xavier looked at him in surprise, and the brown-haired man did not understand such a reaction because he asked to teach him something good and not stealing. It was a silhouette of a man who absorbed the aura streams, because in addition to the assimilated mana, it can attract mana from what surrounds him and transform it into his mana. At that moment, the knight looked at him intently and asked the master how he knew this, because he understood that he had always kept this technique a secret because it was still not complete. Lloyd looked at his teacher with wide eyes and said that he helped him fall asleep, and Xavier talked about it in his sleep. At this time, the main character with a malicious grin and a masked face looked at the teacher, who understood that it was only his imagination that now imagined him with an iron mask on his face. The blue-haired guy looked intently at the brown-haired man, who threw his sword behind his head, and to his regret, said that he could not teach him this technique because it was still not complete. The main character raised his eyebrows with irony, asking if he could complete it, would he be trained? Xavier looked at him with disdain and said if he said so, then perhaps it would be so, but he was embarrassed by this self-confident look. Then Lloyd stuck his sword into the ground. He looked at his hands and tried to insert a finger into his fist, assuming that his mana heart was absorbing mana from outside by itself. Then he was about to hit his fist on his palm and assumed that it bounced off as a result, and as he saw, from the point of view of his heart, external mana is something foreign. Then it was a silhouette of a man with outstretched arms, who absorbed streams of aura because he wanted to change the source. The which he absorbs from outside will not mix with the mana heart. It was a glowing core with pulses of light, because he ordered to let it gather separately. This ball of light began to sparkle and emit streams, because it needed to be rolled up and used. The brown-haired man began to rotate his finger near his fist with a grin and explained that it was like an auxiliary engine near the main engine, because they were one whole, but at the same time worked separately, and it should be great. Xavier looked at him with displeasure and explained that he was sure that it was possible, but did not understand where Lloyd came from before such reasoning. Then the main character stretched out his hands in front of his face, on which there was an iron mask, because he said that he simply imagined. Xavier saw this expression and assumed that he clearly knew something, but just did not show it. The protagonist looked at how his teacher stretched his hands to the sides and began to emit streams of light and aura, because he managed to complete the Astrakhan technique of the mind, which had been bothering him for a long time. It was a blue core that emitted pulses of light around itself, because over the time of his first attempt, the number of contours that he could create increased to 3, and if he trained more, he could reach 4 or even 5 contours. A notification popped up that Xavier's opinion of Lloyd had increased by +5. The protagonist opened his mouth and bulged his eyes in amazement. He was surprised how much he had been taught the mana heart technique, because he didn't need it, because he only wanted to learn part of the absorption, and he didn't need the mana around him, but only the one he touched. Young Mr. Lloyd had such an ability, so Xavier expected that he would defeat the Knight Newman. At that time, the guys were trying to restrain the protagonist, who was bloodthirstily trying to finish off the lying fighter, and triumphantly. At that time, the protagonist's father was furious, hitting the table with his hands, because he did not want to allow him to ruin the knight's reputation any longer. Arcus watched his enraged son being restrained. At this time, the brown-haired man was sweating and trying to catch his breath when he heard about the knight's reputation. Then he pointed a finger at his father in displeasure and told him to look under the tablecloth before he decided whether these words were appropriate for Nikita's knight. A pile of sealed letters lay on the table under a white coverlet. Arcus looked at these letters in horror. While Newman lay writhing in pain, the brown-haired man looked at his father and said that towards who was causing harm to the Baron's estate, and a letter from this scoundrel Knight Newman. Arcus convulsively opened his mouth, holding the letter, because Lloyd explained that it was the furnishings of the estate. What the Baron liked and did not like, and instructions on how to forge property documents, and in these letters everything that they managed to share. The protagonist looked at the agitated Newman with a cold face, not understanding how he found the letters he hid inside the walls. At this time, the protagonist smiled maliciously and said that in the novel, Xavier found them later. He remembered how his little beast Peapodon went to get the letters last night. The father sat down on the chair in horror, looking at the table with the letters. Then he looked at his son, who was staring at him, and realized, as expected, that in the novel he was described as a kind person, because it would be a big fuss if he were to kill him now. Then he closed his lips with a dissatisfied grin and realized that the words kind ruler and good ruler meant completely different things. The protagonist looked at all the nobles at the table and realized that if his father was so worried about how to get rid of this man, then he could offer him something. At this time, the brown-haired man was holding his shovel, while Newman was on the ground, looking at him with excitement. Newman heard that they wanted to put an angry rat on his head and then expel him from the estate, wounded by rats, and if not, then they would demote him to an ordinary soldier and give him a chance to atone for his sins. At this time, the rest of the people were frightened by such a statement, because they understood that it sounded inhuman. Arcus at this time, his eyes bulged in surprise and understood that in order to carry out justice for a minor offense, he would be given a chance to atone, but with a warning of a more severe punishment. Bayern stood next to Xavier and frowned, saying that it was a wise and generous decision and a good warning to others. The protagonist looked at the nobles who sat on the platform, and they agreed to do as he suggested. At this time, the knight with a mustache, without raising his head, said that he had no objections, because he had just been shown mercy. The protagonist looked at him puzzled and tried to understand what kind of mercy. He imagined how a black silhouette of a man sat on a rug in front of his king, and Lloyd understood if he would treat the criminals kindly and whether they would atone for their sins for the forgiveness granted to them. But he realized that this would not happen. Then his black silhouette laughed maliciously, because he realized that in this case they would become more decisive and strong-willed and would try to take advantage of their kindness. At this time, Newman grinned angrily and realized that they would regret this decision, because he would definitely take revenge on this upstart. Newman looked discontentedly from under his brows at the protagonist, who was glad of his smile, and it was a pity that it would be his last. The beaten knight looked at his opponent in bewilderment and asked him to repeat. Then the main character gave a seed to his hamster. Then he threw this beast high into the sun. Lloyd looked at Newman with bloodthirsty arrogance and declared what the best way to ask for forgiveness was, hinting that there was none. At this time, the hamster was deliciously devouring the seed. Then he began to increase in size. The blonde, along with Arcus, looked at what was happening in amazement. Bayern, along with Andri, were also scared and opened their mouths in horror. The rest of the crowd of people bulged their eyes in shock from the black shadow. It was the same hamster that had grown in size. Newman's eyes widened in horror, his mouth opened because the hamster was about to fall on him. This huge pet was flying from the sky with its entire body towards Newman. At that time, the protagonist stood with his back to Newman, his hand on his belt, and there was a bang. The huge hamster was lying on the ground, having crushed the knight. The brown-haired man raised his finger up with a malicious smile and understood that such people should be driven out because this would solve the problem with the rotten man inside the estate forever. It was a huge mountain plain with fields. At that time, Peepodong was throwing the earth. This hamster was throwing it in all directions. Peepodong was digging a ditch along the entire street of the city. The brown-haired man looked at him with a grin, while Xavier tried to understand what his beast was doing. Lloyd replied that he was getting ready to widen the road. They were tired and excited workers who were carrying materials and bags. Then moments later they immediately became pumped up and angry with sweat because they suddenly turned into brave craftsmen. It was a beautiful white tile laid in a path. Lloyd explained that in ancient times there was such a city as Rome and its inhabitants loved roads very much because they built a special road system called the Ippy's Way. The main character looked at the teacher with a grin from under his bangs and said that they would now start from the Baron's house and extend the road to the eastern slope. The protagonist was about to leave, putting his hand in his pockets, while Xavier looked cold-blooded and tried to understand why exactly the road, to which Lloyd replied that he himself would soon see everything. Xavier stared at the grin of his comrade, who said because the popularity of their village would skyrocket. Then the main character looked back with an exclamation when he was asked about where he learned all this. The main character looked at him intently, because Xavier asked about how he came up with the idea of a heating system that they had never heard of before. And he also suddenly learned to summon something from the Vey, and all this looks like high-level magic. The blue-haired knight looked at him with disdain and asked if he was really their master. A red message popped up about the danger that Xavier doubted him. The smooth character looked at him, bulging his eyes. Xavier looked cold-blooded and calm. The brown-haired man threw the shovel over his shoulder and thought with a sullen grin about when he read about this man in the novel. He already knew that he was a capable person and would be able to easily guess if a stranger entered the body of the Baron's son. The embittered knight was immediately going to pull out his blade, because this guy is not to be trifled with, but there is no reason to worry because he has a special skill for such cases. Lloyd twisted his face in horror, his eyes wide, because he studied in secret from everyone and assumed that he could do it. A notification with a special skill of persistence popped up. Lloyd anxiously squeezed his body, approached the teacher, who told him that the young gentleman drank all day long. Lloyd realized that he was being watched every hour of the day, and maybe he used to be a real scoundrel, but he did not know anything about what he was doing all this time. Xavier indifferently looked away and asked how he could explain the skills of a spellcaster, because even a mage with a lot of experience sometimes cannot do this. Xavier stared at the brown-haired man next to him, who was excited, trying to justify himself, and asked him the answer to the question, how did he cope with mana himself, although he was barely over 20, because no one taught him either and he should be a genius, but Xavier did not consider himself one. Lloyd opened his mouth in horror even more because he asked there, could he be a genius, why the teacher did not consider himself as such because he assumed that he suddenly became a genius spellcaster. Xavier looked at him intently with sweat on his brow and did not trust. The knight watched as Lloyd immediately turned around with displeasure and began to leave, adding in pursuit that if he had nothing more to say, then he would go because he still had things to do. Notification that there were with a special skill of fast conversation and persistence. The brown-haired man continued to walk forward and tried to calm down because he realized that Xavier began to suspect him. Then on the way he met Bayern while the workers were sorting out the bags and asked him to monitor the progress of the work while he was gone. The knight in the coat replied that everything would be done and there was nothing to worry about. Then the brown-haired man looked back in surprise at the blue-haired knight, who wanted to go with him, because it was his duty to protect the young gentleman. Lloyd said with irony that such obvious things should not be said at all, because he would definitely go with him, and the knight asked about the way. Xavier began to follow the gentleman, who threw the shovel over his shoulder and looked happy, because he answered that they were going to one place in the footsteps of an unpaid debt. The setting sunset behind the mountain enveloped a small remote town in the Rodinia estate. There was a sign with the inn's name. At this time, the man angrily hit the table with his fist and was indignant. They were transported to the house of the swindler Thords, who looked agitated and embittered because he had lost all his money and wanted to make all the scoundrels pay. At this time, a large guy in a black coat towered over him and asked if this was not the essence of gambling, since he himself earned money in this way. The brunette with a scar looked at the swindler with displeasure and said that since he had such a body, then if he was not able to pay for his services, then he would leave him immediately. Thords looked at the assistant with horror and said that he could pay and would even give him more, so he ordered him to stay near him. His comrade in a black suit said that he would go immediately if he did not receive payment on time. The swindler indignantly grabbed his head and said that he could only earn money by deceiving others, but now too many people would want to settle scores with him, so it was worth lying low for a while. Suddenly, the main character burst into their house with a kick and realized that they were talking about him. Lloyd entered this room, as the swindler immediately jumped up from such impudence. Lloyd looked at him with an eachid namulka and realized that he had not seen him. The main character looked at him maliciously through his bangs and introduced himself by his name. Thords with great horror bulged his eyes and opened his mouth. Thords immediately put his hand on his assistant in black, who offered his help, but the swindler wanted to leave here faster. His assistant immediately bent over the ground, grabbing his master. Then they quickly jumped out of the house through the window. This man in a black suit was about to land on the ground. The man with a scar on his face became angry with discontent. Xavier at this time cut his blade near the shoulder. The knight immediately swung his sword in the air. The knight in blue walked down the street with his sword ordered to give him the swindler and leave himself, and then they will not touch him. Xavier looked at him through his bangs and realized that he had done everything as the young gentleman had said. The big guy in the black suit looked at the man who had blocked his way with displeasure, who knew that they would try to escape through the window, which was why he had waited here. The guy in the suit frowned with displeasure. Then the guy immediately bloodthirstily stretched out his hand with a black magic core and joked about whether the knight even knew how to handle his blade. At this time, the brown-haired man looked through the broken window in surprise and realized that after the death of the Baron, Xavier had longed for together because he had fought with the personal guard of Thords, the swindler whose trail he had managed to attack. Xavier watched as the black mage emitted streams of dark energy because this was his first battle with a dark mage. The knight immediately sat down on the ground, baring his teeth from such pressure and holding onto his sword because it was not easy for him and he had to resist the magic of gravity. Lloyd smiled maliciously because everything was just like in the novel. The dark mage sent a stream of black core towards the knight. Xavier managed to put out his blade to reflect the attack. This black aura tried to surround him from all sides. He immediately found himself in a purple core with dark matter. The dark mage with a grin frowned, stretching out his palm, because he understood that it was predetermined and Xavier must die. A huge fist immediately flew at him. The knight pressed himself to the ground with his feet and tried to convulsively hold the blade. The dark magician looked at what was happening with bewilderment and a sullen grin, because in the novel Xavier fought the scoundrel, being only a simple weapons specialist. The blue-haired knight looked furiously at his opponent with a core in his chest. It was a blue ball that studied matter along the axis, because the real Xavier has a heart of mana triple ring. He immediately swung his sword and cut the barrier. The knight looked away in confusion and tried to understand what it was, whether it was magic that controls gravity. At this time, Dark Max with a drooping look stretched out his fist in the sweat of his brow. The dark magician immediately soared into the sky to escape, but Thords was indignant at such a fate. Xavier immediately went to the swindler, who stretched out his hands in fear because they wanted him for his deception of honest people. The swindler immediately flew into the wooden barrels. The knight arrogantly raised his blade over the scoundrel and said that he would cut off his legs so that he could only crawl into court. He immediately tried to cut the air with his blade. The main character immediately stood in his way with an agitated look. Lloyd immediately began to furiously shout that Xavier had gone crazy, because if he got to court in such a state, then punishment awaited him. The blue-haired knight immediately wilted and was surprised. The main character looked angrily from under his brows at his knight, who did not understand why his master showed sympathy for others. Deep Night stood over the city on the mountain plain. At this time, the swindler was tied to chairs and looked ahead with an agitated look. Lloyd sat with folded hands opposite the swindler with a lost look. Then the brown-haired man waved his hand with a smile and asked Thords not to be afraid. The con man looked excitedly at the protagonist, who stated that when life is at stake, people tend to be greedy, and they will do anything when they get the chance. The protagonist sat opposite him, smiling, leaning on his hands, and stated that cutting off his head would be too cruel. The con man suggested that they were ready to forgive him, but he received a mocking answer that his secret would be taken to the grave. Lloyd smiled animatedly, closing his eyes and leaning his head on his fingers, asking Thords if he was grateful to him, because if so, why not give him all the money back? The con man began to smile with an ironic grin, and said that first he needed to be forgiven. The protagonist continued to look at him with a smile, closed his eyes, and said that he would receive forgiveness, because that was the meaning of their existence. The con man raised his eyebrows and looked at the protagonist in surprise. Then Tully excitedly exclaimed when the protagonist began to take out a piece of paper and said that he would have one more condition. Brown-haired smilingly handed over a piece of paper and a pen so that Thords would simply sign the contract and the matter would be decided. The swindler at this time looked closely at the piece of paper and tried to understand what kind of contract it was. As it turned out, it was a standard labor contract, and he would even receive money for it. Brown-haired continued to smile, resting his chin on his finger, and said that 80% of his salary would be withheld to pay off the debt. The protagonist crossed his arms and with a mocking smile said that in 520 years he would be able to pay him off. The swindler's eyes bulged in horror and his mouth opened. Xavier looked angrily at the smiling protagonist and realized that he should not have expected anything else, because he came here not to sympathize and forgive. The brown-haired man continued to twist his smile in a malicious manner, and he did not consider himself a fool to kill someone who owed him money, because he would definitely not make such a rash step. Then the brown-haired man brought the tube to Talia's head and began to suck it, because he said that he would squeeze all the juices out of him until the end of his worthless life. The swindler immediately exclaimed excitedly, because he was curious why he offered him such a slave contract. The main character looked at him in surprise and realized that Thords had now begun to speak differently. The main character looked at him intently with angry looks, said that they had no choice but to force him to sign this contract by force and resolve this issue in court. The swindler immediately began to sign this contract with tears in his eyes. White clouds floated in the sky. At this time, the cart was carrying the guys along a forest path. The main character was riding in the cart with the knight and the swindler. Xavier held the blade on his shoulder and said that he managed to get some money from it, because it was enough to pay the interest for a couple of months. Lloyd did not understand what was being discussed,